Okay, welcome back, members, ladies and gentlemen, and can I welcome our second panel of witnesses this morning. Laura Caven, Chief Officer, Children and Young People Team and Co-Chair of Additional Support for Learning Project Board with COSLA. Alison Bavidge, National Director of the Scottish Association of Social Work. Ben Ferrugia, Director, Social Work Scotland, and Stephen Smiley, Chair of the Social Work Issues Group, Unison Scotland. I know some of you, if not all of you, were listening to the previous session, so you'll have heard what our first panel said, and my questions are going to be largely the same, so you've heard some of their responses, and I know particularly my latter points, they were saying you may be better suited to answer. But first of all, on the workforce issue, what are the challenges facing the workforce in delivering the promise and the commitment that's been made? Ms Bavidge?
Well, I mean, first of all, social workers enter the profession to build positive relationships. Human rights, agency, social justice, all the key elements of the promise. So, you know, and social workers do that across adults, children's and justice services. And I think that's something that I will want to keep coming back to today, in that children don't sit on their own. They are part of families and part of communities. And you've heard this morning the shift of social work role towards organising care and crisis intervention and the impact that has had on relationships. Their role in balancing tensions between families and the state and between needs and resources. And the impact of austerity and the issues that now we have about lack of early support and preventative work. Nearly half of social workers are dissatisfied with their jobs, and 32% report strong emotional responses such as crying at least once a week. Okay, so we have some problems. I do want to say something about the relationship between national and local government, because that profoundly affects our profession. We're seen as a national profession, but our delivery is localised across 32 local authorities, and then, of course, we have NHS Highland for adult services. So consistency is a recurrent issue, and I did hear reference to postcode lottery previously. You've heard about the recruitment and retention challenge in social work. To fix this, we're going to require resources, significant resources, and real political commitment. There's been an 8% drop in student numbers over the last 2 years, and bursaries was mentioned several times earlier this morning, and I'll certainly want to talk about that. Large caseloads then, lack of resources and insufficient support from employers are issues. But also this is one that not everybody will agree with, the localised approach to pay and conditions, localised approach to professional development and poor salary increases. We've been looking at health and teachers. Teachers have had a 33% rise, I think, since 2018. Interestingly, there's a surplus of new teachers, whilst social work has a vacancy rate of about 10%. So there's a reason why people are choosing teaching and not social work, perhaps. We heard about the range of tactics and needing a proper strategy and adequate resources. But we also need trust on professionals rather than micromanaging through lots of guidance, lots of legislation and small ring-fence grants. We have a lot of ministers who impact on the social work arena and very many complex policy areas that affect social work with insufficient time, insufficient capacity in the sector and insufficient financial resource. So we've got work to be done to ensure that the workforce is in a fit state to deliver the promise. And social workers need to see themselves as a valued and crucial part of the promise, as part of the solution. But that's a kind of quick rundown of the fundamental issues.
Any others?
To pick up, Stephen, just please after you.
No, you go first.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. It's great to be here and really great to listen to the first panel. If the committee will humour me with a list, I'll run through some. I hope of the challenges. Well, of course, it's only 4 pages. I think keeping the focus on the purposeful work, which Trish mentioned in the first panel, I think that's absolutely critical. Doing the work which social work is trained to do, relationship-based, asset-based, strength-building work. The complexity of the issues which families face, I think Fiona spoke to that very eloquently as well. I think we've got to hold that in mind. We're talking about poverty, drug and alcohol use, unemployment. We're talking about disparate families spread. You know, we're talking about a lot of complexity that social workers are trying to manage. Sometimes children already in care, some still with families. It's a very challenging, complex situation that families face. The retention of experienced social workers, I have taken to just saying retention, to paraphrase someone else's speech from a long time ago, but that really is the focus. I think we need to be absolutely laser focused on that issue. The recruitment is important, and of course on my list too is the preparation of incoming social workers, but ensuring that we have experienced social workers staying in the system is key to good recruitment. And we heard that from a number of the previous panel. If we don't have experienced social workers there who can provide the support, the learning opportunities for new ones, we burn through the new ones and they leave within a few years, as our research has shown. And also, to echo from others, the too big, too incoherent legislative and policy agenda. We've had activist change through policy for 2 decades or more, and we need now some stasis. We need a stable policy and legislative environment with which to get on with the core business of social work. And that applies across the whole social work landscape, not just children and families.
Mr. Smiley.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I agree with much of what's already been said. From our perspective, we Unison welcomed, as Voice of Social Workers welcomed the promise, but at the time we did produce a report following a survey of our members, and people were very positive about it, but regularly right across they were making the point you shouldn't really be making promises to children if you can't keep them. And a few years down the road we have to say, well, we're at risk of actually delivering on that prediction. There have been lots of issues that cut across it, but we said at the time we won't be able to do this if we don't increase levels of funding and if we don't increase or address the issues of caseload and workload management within the workforce. And briefly, we haven't been able to do that. We have a workforce now which is overworked, it's overstressed, the levels of absence are higher, the levels of vacancies we've already heard about. There was a question earlier on about productivity. The social workers and family support workers and others in the workforce have been addressing that kind of issue by essentially working more than their 35 hours on a regular basis in order to complete cases, in order to see a family that I haven't been able to see this week or this month sometimes. We're asking and expecting more and more from a workforce that is under enormous pressure and have been for a number of years. This is not new. We've been saying this for a number of years. Funding is a critical issue. Local government funding has not kept pace with the overall funding that the Scottish Government has got. We know that. That's a repeated theme that you'll get from anybody in Unison. And that impacts on social work and children's services as well as it does in other local government workforces. We have had the temporary short-term funding that we've heard a little bit about this morning. And that's obviously any funding is welcome, but I think Fraser made the point we'd rather have money which we knew we were going to get next year and the year after, rather than just a big burst of money now that we need to try and spend over the next year or two. But even that additional money, which has actually produced some very, very good projects and initiatives where, I mean, you could gather a group of senior managers, some of us occasionally join them, and they can speak about this. This is a really good project. That's a really good project. This is a really good project. The contribution that's been made from housing or health or police or whatever, as well as social work, these are really good projects. But I think it was Mr. Rennie that made the point that they fail to look over their shoulders at the fire that's burning back in the basement. I think you said there's a fire in the basement, and that's the reality. So there's been a lot of good work done, but it hasn't addressed the fundamental issues that come from that. There is a failure to have proper investment in the front line. Fraser referred to the front line, and he made the point about the back. The admin workers are being cut back. We now have social workers who have to cope with admin work that they never had to do before. And frankly, that's not what they're trained to do. They're not very good at it sometimes. That takes up a lot of time. We have still having to fill in 10-page reports. So they can spend half an hour talking to a family and 4 hours writing up the report, because that's the bureaucracy that they have to contend with. That's not been addressed in any significant way. One of the downsides of the funding streams that have come in where councils have been able to set up special teams, special projects, initiatives, is that a lot of the experienced workers have gravitated towards those projects because they are more rewarding, they achieve things, and it gets them out of the child protection, sharp crisis management stuff that everybody else has to deal with. That meant that those teams, those crisis management teams, are relying on newly qualified social workers more than they should do. I mean, there should be a balance in those sort of teams of experience and newly qualified. But the experienced workers have either left the service altogether or moved to these other projects, and that's weakened that front line. And therefore that contributes to what we've heard about the burnout, early burnout of people. And finally, we've heard a bit about workforce planning. We'll maybe come and talk about that a bit more, but we don't have genuine workforce planning across the country, and that's one of the things that the National Social Work Agency, should it ever arrive, will, we hope, address. But it's been a long time coming, and we're sitting waiting for it, and it, there needs to be. So there's a crisis which we've heard about. The staff are burning out, they're stressed. They're still doing lots of very, very good work. I wouldn't want to sort of make these comments without praising the efforts of social workers and family support workers and other parts of the workforce who still get out of the bed early in the morning in order to try and do what they can and work late at night in order to catch up, even at the weekend. People who take work home at weekends, they do a great deal of work to try and protect children, to deliver on the promise, but they're weighed down by bureaucracy, they're weighed down by shortage of staff, and they're having to cover their back. So that's the general situation.
Okay, thank you. I understand that was a broad opening question, but we will have to keep things a little bit concise to get round all members. But just lastly from me, I made the point about the figures that show since 2019 a big rise in the number of senior children's social workers, and albeit a little one, but a reduction in the number of children's main social workers. Is that balance correct? Are you happy that the senior numbers are going up and the main children's numbers are falling? Or is there more to those figures than those headlines?
Well, I think the first thing I point to the figures is that you're comparing a big percentage of a small number with a decline. I think over 2,000.
But one's going up and one's going down.
One's
so the
going
trend
up.
is
Indeed. I think that I think those figures overall to me show a children and family social work profession that has effectively remained static over the past decade or more, when our ask of that profession has increased, as Stephen and Alison has said. Actually, in those who hold cases, we have a decrease. So we're asking them to do more. That doesn't even then take account of our vacancy rate, which has been mentioned, sickness absence, which doesn't feature in a vacancy rate, and social work is peculiarly hard hit by things, partly because of the demography of the profession, also the fact that this is a profession that has worked flat out through the pandemic, as hard as any other, and has not stopped since. And so we do have pretty high rates of sickness absence. Those cases, those responsibilities fall on those who remain. And we're now trapped in something of a, I don't want to use the word doom loop, but we're trapped in a really difficult situation where we're asking more and more of fewer and fewer people. So I take from that, convener, that we effectively, if at best, I think that rise in seniors just reflects the fact that we have people who move through the profession and they change. What we're really struggling to do is to hold on to those who are providing the relationships with children and families. And that's where our focus has to be. Again, we need to focus on retention, and we need the ability to fill those vacancies, but also expand the profession, in my view. Not dramatically, but we have the need. And this extends beyond, as Stephen rightly said, beyond social workers, because, again, the SSSE keeps figures for all of the necessary roles here. And we're seeing a squeeze across the piece.
So just to clarify, you think it's right that there have been more seniors in that 48% rise since 2019, but you would have preferred, presumably, that the main social workers rose at the same level?
Absolutely, yes.
Yep. Mr. Smiley.
One of the things we've argued for a long time is there needs to be a much better career structure for social workers so that they can come in and, instead of just aspiring to become a manager and move her up and away from frontline, that we have something at the low level. So many councils have introduced senior practitioners, and I think that was partly reflected in the figures you're talking about. So it's about keeping social workers in the front line, but taking on some additional responsibility, some specialist work, for example. And that's a good thing. We're keen on that. The problem has been there's been no great additional money to enable to afford that, because you need to pay them a bit more money. So what you've seen in a number of areas, we've introduced senior practitioners. So they're not disappearing into the management structure. They are still part of the local team. But in order to pay for that, we've had to reduce the numbers, because we've got a standstill budget, so we have to reduce the numbers of actual social workers in order to have some additional senior practitioners. And that's, I'm not sure exactly the detail of those figures and whether that reflects it, but that's certainly something which has happened. So we're trying to keep people there, but we're losing the total number of people on the ground.
Okay. George Adam.
Good morning. I'm going to go down a similar route to what I asked earlier on, but we keep hearing about recruitment and retention of social workers, and how do we manage that? Now, I can understand a social worker will go in for all the right reasons to help people, to help families, to deliver for that, but with many of the challenges you've already outlined, there may be difficulties by the time for them to continue. So what would be the best way forward for us all to actually try and get these recruitment and retention issues going? I know they're two separate questions effectively. There's the recruitment, and then once they're in, it's the retention as well. So how do we manage that, and how do we kind of find a way forward?
I'll start that. So first of all, it's during training. It's ensuring that people can get through the front door of training and complete courses. The graduate apprenticeship scheme has been kind of one alternative, but in fact, if we don't simply make it easier for people that often come to social work later than they do to other professions. A lot of us don't come to it until our late 20s, early 30s, by which time we often have caring responsibilities. It's a very female occupation, 84% of women, and some of the students that we've talked to have had real difficulty finishing are single parents, for example. So bluntly, we need bursaries. We need a way that people can commit to doing a 4 or a 2-year postgraduate course that has a lot of placement time when you can't work. We need to look at pay. Local authorities pay different rates of pay, and that's one of the reasons that they cite for sometimes their difficulty in filling vacancies. And so there's a conversation to be had about that. Professional conditions, ensuring that there's employer support for that tension, that risk management tension. Social workers, part of the burnout is not feeling supported in taking decisions, particularly ones that, if you like, don't look like the absolute safest decision, but in allowing families to kind of grow and flourish, have their independence and be supported in that. Okay, so we need employer support, supervision by professional social workers for professional social workers. I think that's really important. I don't think there are many other professions we would want to see being supervised in a professional way by a different profession, but in our integrated, which is mainly adults, that quite often happens. And purposeful work, meaningful work, satisfying work, which means being with people over a period of time, building trusting relationships with communities so we're not seen as the outsiders coming in to do something in a crisis, but that the role is understood and that the community supports that and that is able to help people through difficult times and struggling families. In Germany, Germany, they give social workers a number of hours to spend per week with families. It might be 3 hours, it might be 6, it might be 12 hours, but that's how their caseload is managed, rather than the number of tasks that we do here.
Well, one of the things Ben mentioned, you might be able to help in this as well, Alison, is the fact that I can't remember the hours you mentioned, 2 hours with a family and 4 hours doing the report. Now,
Hours for the report.
Okay,
so.
then.
No, it's just for clarity.
But basically, that's an issue. And I know councils and local authorities do it when they do their budgets, think this way. But from a sheer management perspective, a social worker costs a lot more than an administrator would to actually do it. So surely councils will be looking at ways to have that administrative support. To me, that makes sense. And I know it would be a budget line, having been a former councillor myself. I know it would be a budget line, but it would be one that I would look at and say, no.
Well, there are things that social workers have to do. They have to complete their reports. They have to be responsible for the analysis and writing reports, recommendations and risk management. But there are other jobs that could be helped. But there's a lot of work in trying to get through some of our local authority financial systems in order to get resource for people. There's layers and layers. I think in one of the Social Work Scotland reports from last year, somebody had to fill in 17 forms to kind of get through a process to get the resource that they needed for a family. Now, that's exhausting, not satisfying, lots of tensions in that system, think of the money that's being spent in that system. So they're the kinds of things that we need to look at. There's definitely a role for a lot of administrative support. And I know that we're looking into bits of artificial intelligence and things that can also help, which we need to be thoughtful about. I don't know if that helps.
No, that is helpful, particularly with artificial intelligence, but that's a whole different discussion we're on to then. Ben, do you have anything else to say on that?
Yeah, I think Alison's answered the question well. I think I try and answer them both together, recruitment and retention, in the interest of time. I think a number of things need to happen at the same time. So the standardised career kind of model, which Stephen was talking about, with meaningful opportunities to advance without having to move into management, helping us to retain experienced staff. Financial support for students, more innovation in the routes, and I suppose reflecting on something that Professor McCulloch said earlier, that there is some debate about the graduate scheme, and I hold it as an example of actually the distance which has grown between the operational profession and those who are responsible for training and equipping our social workers, our universities primarily, and I think that we have an opportunity actually.
What do you really think of the graduate scheme?
We're in favour of it. We're in favour. There's a long history in Scotland of grow your own schemes in local government, successful, widely enjoyed by those who've done them and valued by those who bring in social workers through those models. So we've been a supporter of the Scottish Government building that model. But we know and understand why our universities are hesitant, and they have good and legitimate concerns which need to be considered about it. But we do want more innovation routes. I think Alison might have already mentioned, the fact that we have unemployed teachers. We should be actively talking about conversion courses for those people who've been trained in very similar skills. That, we need to be having a space. I suppose that brings me to the national social work structures that are being discussed now. And I think that's always these reasons, the need to do a lot of these things simultaneously is the reason why we as Social Work Scotland have been an originator of the idea and supportive for 5+ years now of this. It is a means to an end, and I suppose it's an opportunity for me to say it is not a solution to any of the workforce problems. It is a red herring. A national social work agency or structures is not going to fix things in social work. But we do need some national coordination to attend to these things on a PAN 32 basis. We have a single national profession managed across 32 local authorities. That doesn't even include all of those who work in the third sector. So this is an opportunity for us to do so. The introduction of technology should be done appropriately, with confidence, but across all 32. We can't have a situation, which we're likely to have in the current model, where one area is running with artificial intelligence and others are saying, for 5 years, no, we can't do anything. We're going to exacerbate our current situations in the workforce if social workers have the ability to say, well, there I get a tool that means all my notes are done for me, but in the other one, I'm going to have to go back and spend 4 hours typing up my notes and preparing those things. We need to grapple with that. National structures are a means to do that, but it's not a solution in themselves.
If I can say, I think to sum up the crisis in recruitment is you speak to social workers about whether they'd recommend their children becoming social work, and quite a number of them said no, tell them to go and be a teacher or be doing something else. We need to get it right on the job so that those people are advocates for the profession itself. So that's part of it. The graduate apprenticeship scheme, we very much welcome that. We've got lots and lots of really quality staff working as family support workers, social work assistants, residential care workers, who would be ideal social workers, but for the reasons explained before, they can't afford to leave the work to go and do the course at university, and even the small number of employers who were able to support people through it, schemes, that was minimal, and there's a lot of competition. So we welcome that. It needs to be worked through properly, and we need to get proper support. But that would be one. The existing social workforce, the wider social workforce, would be a pool for recruitment and training for social workers.
Local authorities have history in doing that, where people go down one career and then just jump and do something else because they've got the skill set from elsewhere. That's more a statement, convener, than a question. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, convener. This is a fairly dramatic question. What action can the Scottish Government take now to offer support to social work staff and trainees that you would like to see? What's your main call that you really want to see as soon as possible?
Please.
So I think it would be really helpful if we could have a look at sequencing of all the different commitments that have been made, all the different policy commitments, legislative commitments that social work and wider professions are being asked to deliver. Just now, as your previous panel talked about, there's an incredibly complex landscape, and as the Celsius research said, a really complex landscape. I think it was clear that it was talking about where is GARFIC, where is UNCRC, where is the promise, how do all these relate? And we've got, obviously, things like the Care and Justice Bill, all of the wider commitments around the Promise Bill and the consultations that are out just now. Just a bit of sequencing and a bit of thought about actually what do we need to do first to make the most impact, and what needs to happen before the next thing happens in order for the next thing to be effective, if that makes sense. So I think that that would be a really helpful way for Scottish Government, working with local government, working with wider stakeholders, to kind of sit down and have a think about, just planning and sequencing of that. And I'm really hoping that the Promise Progress Framework will help with that, because we'll be able to look at the data that we have just now and look at where we are making progress, where we are making less progress, and where perhaps we need to focus more of our attentions in a more immediate sense.
Thank you. From that, just a wee second, please, Stephen, just to get this correct. What you're basically saying is that you want more cooperation between all the bodies that actually work?
I think cooperation isn't the right word, because there is cooperation there. I think that we work very well together. We all work very well together. We work well with Scottish Government. But I think that often you have bits of policy or commitments that come from perhaps different bits of Scottish Government that aren't necessarily aligned. And that's not necessarily a criticism, it's just the way that the systems operate, and it's just the way that things have emerged. And I think that if we could come together, and I know that there is work being done at a senior level and across government as well, and local government, to bring all of these things together so that we can do a bit of planning. So I wouldn't say it's cooperation, it is coordination rather than cooperation.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Alison, Stephen wanted to jump in there, but do you want to wait till Alison?
I mean, just as a point of interest, in our last business year, we responded to 34 government consultations that impacted enough on social work that we thought we had to say something. Now, that just shows you across children's justice, adults, the type of the amount of work that's hitting the sector, and that's in addition to a lot of the National Care Service stuff, which has sucked a lot of capacity, thinking capacity, planning, implementation capacity out of the sector at the moment. So that there is something about that social work doesn't have, and I think this is why a National Social Work Agency with clout at government level, real clout at government level, at budget and about phasing and prioritising work is really important. Because when you hit with these 34 different things over a period of a year, and this is just us as a professional association, when that then comes through implementation and through local authorities, through what looks like, some people think of it as a simple bit of implementation, you've got to do that, but there's 34 other priorities, and then you're doing it 34 different times, 33 different times, plus the third sector, plus the voluntary sector. So there needs to be a recognition of the complexity of social work, that it is a single profession, and it cannot operate without looking at all of these other bits. Right? Children do not exist on their own, generally, fortunately. And if they do, we put grown-ups around them.
Thank you very much for that, Alison. And Stephen?
Yeah, obviously I'd get slaughtered if I didn't respond to this by saying funding is a major issue. We need more funding in the system in order to shore up the crisis which exists, which would allow us the comfort and space to actually change. We talked about transformational change in the promise. We don't have transformational funding to actually achieve that. So that's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. And I think this is budget day to day, so we're all hopeful fingers are crossed. But essentially, until we get more money into that frontline social work delivery, we aren't going to be able to make the transformational change that we've got, because we'll have a workforce continuing in crisis. And a crisis workforce can't make transformational change. They become defensive, they become reactive, they deal with crisis.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. And Ben?
I would echo what Stephen said. I think we're not naive about the financial situation which Scotland faces and the challenge of what has to happen this afternoon. We're not sitting here holding out a huge amount of hope, but I think I agree with Stephen. It is a metric for this committee and for all of us in terms of understanding whether we're going to deliver the promise, about whether we're investing the necessary resources to do so. If that pot is going down, delivery of the promise is less likely, not more likely. But I think I probably, in view of the fact that that is difficult, the job of government is difficult, having to make choices across any number of equally important issues, I suppose the bit that strikes me, in view of the financial situation, something that is in their control is the level of policy activity that they undertake. And you asked a bold question, I'll give a bold answer, which is it is within their power to pause all of their relevant policy activity until the end of this Parliament and say, we have got an enormous agenda of implementation in front of us. We can focus on that. And we're committing to not do any more consultations. Our job is to create an enabling environment for the professions, all of the professions who are responsible for delivering the promise. That's something that is, I think, driven by the evidence in terms of what we're feeding back, what the financial situation is for the government, for local government. I think that would be a great step.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. Well, to build on that, Mr Smiley, I mean, you said there should be transformational funding. I think we can assume there will not be. So the question is, what can we do with the present funding? Because, I mean, I think, you know, well, I don't know what the budget's going to say, but, I mean, it looks like the NHS is going to continue to be the priority, which means local government won't get so much. So, given that situation, how can we work better with the resources we've got? And I'm thinking particularly of other professions apart from actually social workers. So presumably in this space, we have teachers, we have police, we have third sector, youth workers, all of these kind of things. Are they a factor in delivering the promise?
Of course they are. All of them are. All of them are extremely busy and people already. And when you speak to teachers, which I do on a regular basis, less so, fortunately less so the police, I have to say. But I speak to teachers on a daily basis. They're up to here, so asking them to do more would be a challenge as well.
Would it be a question of being more joined up, perhaps?
There's always scope for more coordination and sharing. Claire earlier on talked about the Sure Start, where people are based in one place. In more recent times, we've got family hubs and places like that, where yes, people can access it. So yes, there's room for that. That doesn't come cheap either. You know, you've got buildings and all the rest. But in principle, yes, these things would help. Doing away with some of the bureaucracy. I was speaking to a social work manager just last week, and he was talking about work that they're doing with the children's reporters to look at the current 10-page, I think it's a 10-page report they have to do for to go to the hearings, and they're working on actually reducing that to 3 pages, and that would make a big difference in terms of. So that kind of there is scope for that kind of improvement if we could reduce that kind of thing.
So that's kind of working better rather than someone else doing the work. Kind of thing.
Yes, working better and not having to cut and paste, constantly repeating the same thing you did before and stuff like that. So there's work to be done on that. AI is a possibility. We have concerns about AI, as everybody else in the world has concerns about AI, but it's worth exploring. We think there could be scope for that. I have to say that when we start having these kind of discussions, however, the practice or experience in the past is, we'll find a way to do something a wee bit better, therefore we can cut a budget somewhere else, and that's a real risk. And if there's going to be discussions about that kind of work, from a trade union point of view, we would be wanting to have agreements with employers, with the government, that won't be, there'll be protection of budgets so that if jobs are going to be better, we can have more of them and do more and achieve more. So those things are all, but the point you make about all those other people rely on social work. If you don't have that strong social work in there, then the teachers might be able to identify issues with kids, but there's some research done, I can't remember who did it, but they talked to teachers in one local authority, and they basically said there's no point phoning the social work department because they don't have time, they never get back to us because they're too hard pressed. So if you don't have a strong social work, all the other stuff, all the other people will be limited in what they can do to address the issues of the promise.
Okay, thanks for that. Mr Frigia, I mean, the independent care review talked about maybe a lack of evidence and data around this space, I think, of other non-social work workers, professions. Is that the case? And is there a lack of data around who does what or so on?
there is a lack of data. We've got critical roles that are not registered roles, so it's harder to have a clear understanding of them. The care system, and I think Fiona's right in sort of putting parentheses around it, it's a big and complex multi-component thing. It is actually a partnership between the public sector and the third sector primarily in how we deliver it these days, both in terms of, well, kind of all aspects really. There are some aspects of this which are very definitely the preserve of local government social work, but in the care and the support that we provide to children and families, the third sector is absolutely critical. It's also important, and Stephen's mentioned a few times, local government itself is a big employer of other workforces and professions that are also critical here. Family support workers span both the public sector and others. You started, I think, your question about other professions as well, and they're critical. I mean, I think from our point of view, it is not possible to deliver the promise by 2030 or 2035 without change and improvement in how some of those other settings and workforces approach care experience, children and adults. I think that's absolutely essential. But the route to delivering the promise runs through social work, as Stephen said. It runs through that social work workforce. They're the thread that runs through everything. And I suppose I think now, reflecting 5 years on, that perhaps we have spent 5 years perhaps almost giving everything equal value in respect of the workforce issues, and not acknowledging that actually if we don't shore up and improve the social work workforce, any improvements that we can make in schools and health and others are going to be mitigated and undermined by the fact that we're not concentrating on the core foundation of our care system, which is social work.
Okay. Ms Cavan, I mean, from a causeless point of view, obviously you've got kind of oversight of all that all that councils do. I mean, is the system kind of joined up enough, or is there a balance, or is the balance not right?
In terms of the promise specifically, we have within local government a promise programme board, which is chaired by a Solace rep, a chief executive, Jim Savage from Aberdeenshire, which has representatives from across the professional associations in local government. So we have obviously Social Work Scotland represented by a Chief Social Work Officer. We've got ADES, so Director of Education. We've got Housing represented. We've got Youth Work represented. We have Directors of Finance. We have Local Authority lawyers, heads of HR, probably others that I'm forgetting about, but really recognising that this is not just social work, absolutely core, but this is not just about social work, and you need that leadership from chief exec level, from local and national government level, in order for the promise to be delivered, and for other parts of the workforce and local government to see their role in the promise and keeping the promise. So I think that at that kind of level, we have absolutely got leadership there. And I think the other thing that I was going to pick up on, Ben and I have had regular conversations recently about the role of health in keeping the promise, and specifically how we better involve our health partners in some of this work and some of these discussions as well. So I think there is a recognition and there is absolutely an understanding across the professions of their role in keeping the promise. But as Stephen, I think, said, that everyone is under increasing pressure as budgets become tighter and demand and the circumstances that families are living in become more challenging.
Okay. And I mean, where would the third sector fit in? Obviously that's out with councils, but would that vary around the country as to how the third sector gets involved?
That's a really good point, actually. So within the local government programme board, we don't have representation from the third sector, but we do have good relationships at a national level with third sector organisations. It will vary across the country because there are obviously different third sector organisations across the country and different geographical and demographic needs across the country. But they are a core partner in this. They are absolutely fundamental in how local authorities and the public sector partners work to keep the promise. So there is probably more we can do through the Promise Programme Board that I mentioned there to bring in the third sector. I think that there's probably a lot more that we can do to have those conversations at a national level. The other places that those happen are within the the Children and Families National Leadership Group that Scottish Government Solid chaired again, where we have representation across public sector partners as well as third sector partners, and there's a clear space there for better connections. But again, the kind of delivery aspect of it would be at a local level, but that doesn't stop the conversations happening at a national level about how that can be facilitated.
Okay, that's very helpful, thanks. And Ms Babbage, I mean, it sounds like things are quite, in a sense, quite joined up at a local level. Does the Scottish Government need to be doing more, do you think, in this space of the other professions that are involved with the promise?
I suppose that's a difficult one to answer directly, because there's a role for national government, and then there's a relationship with local government and how local government then delivers locally. One of the things you asked earlier on is, could we do more by involving more of other professions around the table? I think a lot of that work is done, people put a lot of effort into that work locally. I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about is about how social work itself could improve its efficacy. I do have concerns about hyperspecialism, about that you have to go in through an adults' justice or children's door. I think Sure Start is a good example of where that issue began to become much more integrated, models of community social work. However, a lot of these things now get into kind of trouble because where budget lines and where governance lines sit have become really, really difficult. And again, that's one of the difficulties for social work as a holistic profession, and why you can have families, as I think Fraser said earlier today, with multiple workers, which takes a lot of capacity out of the system, it puts a lot of stress and tension into families, instead of having a holistic approach with somebody, the right profession, holding the case. If
and
you
can
like,
that be fixed at a local level?
That can be fixed. That should be able to be fixed at a local level with the right support. But we are all aligned, and partly because of integration. There are some issues, I think, for social work when we talk about the satisfying work of over the last 30 years about how some of the work that we used to do in communities and in the early preventive stuff is now not seen as part of the statutory work, and other people do that. So how do we, place-based, neighbourhood working has to be part of our answer, that people know where to come. There's one front door. That older adults, that children, that adults with substance use and mental health problems can get through the door simply and easily without having 7 different workers attached to their families. There's something about, and Mark Smith of Gateshead talks about this, is about a generous approach where people can deal with 75 to 80% of the issues now, here, without having to re-refer on. The capacity that's used up by re-referring is immense. It's very expensive, and social workers are generically trained and should be able to do, as GPs do, the significant amount of deal with the support and the needs that come through the door 75–80% of the time, whilst having their own specialisms and those of their colleagues to fill in the gaps for that kind of more difficult specialist need.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Willie Rennie.
Laura Cavan, if there's this programme board, why is there such wide variation on the performance of local authorities? The Who Cares Scotland report that was published earlier this year was pretty stark. So why is that variation existing?
Variation will always exist because of the fact that we're dealing with families who are complex, and every family is complex, and therefore different factors.
So just for clarity purposes, so there is a requirement, an intention for independent advocacy to be available in every local authority, but it's not. So why isn't it?
I don't actually have an answer to that, so maybe I could follow up in writing once I've checked the kind of what is available at what local authority. Maybe some of my colleagues could answer some of that. I think that to answer your question about why is there variation if we've got this programme board, because this is a work in progress. I accept that we are almost 5 years into when the promise was published. We'll be at the midway point in February, but this is still like a work in progress. The programme board has been in place for, I think, just over a year. And there's been a number of challenges since the Care Review published in February 2000 that were unforeseen as well. So there's a whole range of factors that mean that we haven't necessarily made the progress that we might have anticipated and wanted to have made at the speed at which we would have wanted to make it back in 2000. But to answer your question, absolutely accept that things are not where they need to be. And that is why we have a programme board, that is why we're having these conversations, and that is why we are trying to make things better and improve things for families.
I was hoping we would have a representative here that would understand the landscape and why there is the variation from COSLA, because you are a major player in the delivery of keeping the promise, really important player. And you've heard the frustration that I don't know if you were in the earlier session, the frustration that care experienced young people are expressing. They are incandescent with rage. And therefore, I would suggest that COSLA needs to be much more on top of this if we are to try and deal with some of these issues. And it's no criticism of you, but my concern is that that variation is a major part of the problem. So let me just ask you a follow-up. I'll get to the others in a second. The whole Family Wellbeing Fund, why couldn't we get the money out the door?
Yep, I can definitely answer that one. So the money was delayed coming out to local authorities in the first place, and then it's short-term funding, so it's difficult for local authorities to work with. And the additional factor in that was the fact that it wasn't for local authorities to decide how that money was spent. It was to work with community planning partnerships or children's services planning partnerships in order to make decisions about what the best use of that funding would be at a local level. And then for that funding to be used. But because it's short term, because it's like there's a time scale for getting that out and getting that spent, it means that there is a delay. And then you've got to think about the things like recruitment. You can't just recruit someone the day after funding is provided or funding is distributed. So there are delays such as that. And then even if you could recruit the next day, how many people are going to leave a post for a short-term funded post that is for that period at which the funding extends for a year or however long. So there are a variety of factors like that that mean that it's really quite difficult. But I think it's a new way of doing things and a new way of funding being distributed and a new way of working in terms of it being a decision that's community planning partnership or children's services planning partnership decision, rather than it being about what local authorities by themselves identify as a priority. So I think that going forward it should be much slicker, but in order for that to be the case it will need to be a long-term commitment. And also it is 500 million doesn't sound like a small amount of money, but I think that was over 5 years, maybe 6 years now. It is a relatively small amount of money in terms of what we're expecting and asking of it, and supporting whole families in a way that meets their community's needs.
So it's not a long-term commitment, it's limited. Does that mean you'll still have the same problems about people not wanting to take up a position because the money is not there for the long term? Do you still have that problem? Yeah?
Yeah.
So have you told government that, and what have they said?
Absolutely. So we have fed that back. I think that there's an evaluation either just published or on its way out, and we have fed that back. And again, I mean, the Scottish Government obviously deal with short annual budgets as well, so I accept that they're in that position too. So they have listened, they've heard our concerns, they've heard the concerns of the wider community planning partners as well. That's the situation we're in.
Okay, one final question before I know the others are keen to get in. So there are claims that this money is just being used to patch up budget holes elsewhere. Can you guarantee that that's not happening?
That's a really difficult question, because in order for funding to... We keep talking about, or government keep telling local government that these pots of money, whether it's this one or whether it's about early adopters or whatever funding it is, it has to be about additionality. It has to be about something new. but at the same time local authorities' budgets have been reduced and they've had to make savings elsewhere. And if you are creating a new service, or you are relying on a service or something, a profession or group of professionals that were always there that now aren't because they've had to be, that there's been a saving made and those professions aren't there anymore, or that service isn't there anymore, then something that you were going to build on top of that doesn't have anything to build upon. I don't know if I'm making...
No,
so
I
we were
understand
talking
it. I
about the
understand.
delivery of a service from a community centre, but the community centre is now shut. So you then have to redesign the service.
So it's additional to the reduced service, but not additional to what was there before.
Aye.
Yeah, sort of. Okay, right, Mr. Fraser.
I suppose I wanted to come back to your first question, why is there variation? I think it's an absolutely legitimate question, Mr. Rennie, and there is variation. I think Laura said it right. Areas are set up differently. The history of areas is different. As you will know, representing your communities, and those communities' needs are different, and that is all then reflected in some degree of different setup in each of those areas. And I think there is a broader philosophical/constitutional question about whether that's right to have that. I think to make this parochial about social work, though, since the 90s, when we moved from regional to a 32 local authority structure, and as Alison has pointed out, 33 if we bear in mind that actually in Highland adult social workers are employed by the NHS. Social work is set up very differently across the 32 now, particularly 20 years plus on from that. And the role, I'm going to use the word power, of social work within those systems is very different. I reflect somebody who's been close to the experience, as Claire and others have been on the previous panel, around Glasgow's transformation. I think, the story there is important and it is valid, and I think there is lots to take from it. But one thing that I don't think gets pointed out enough is that social work in that health and social care partnership is very strong. And those conversations that Claire was saying about the ability to bring those budgets together to hold is in some part down to the fact that actually social work has a strong voice in that. That is not the case across the 32. I think your question, I think, leads to us back to that question about what is the role of national structures in social work. Because actually, I think what we talk about in Social Work Scotland is the minimum acceptable variation, taking account all those things about geography and demography and all those things, which are realities. But we should be clear on what that minimum is. And I think national structures around social work, which will have an impact on local government, and at Social Work Scotland, we're not pretending otherwise, particularly when it comes to their ability to make certain decisions in this area. It will have an impact on that if, in our view, it needs to, if it's going to be effective. But I think that is one of those areas where it can really show its value.
Good others. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worth making the point that, and I'm sorry to come back to funding again, budgets again, but local government budgets have been under a lot of pressure. And was that, for many, many years, social work budget was protected within councils. Most councils would say, we'll try and make the cuts somewhere else. We'll protect social work. Over the past few years, social work directors up and down the country have had to say what's statutory and what's non-statutory. And we'll need to offer the non-statutory stuff up for savings. And so a number of projects, a number of teams, a number of services have been trimmed, sliced, or indeed removed over the years because we need to protect statutory. And therefore, when additional money comes in, albeit on a temporary basis, you find that some of these things are getting recreated, maybe with a different name and slightly different shape and colour and all the rest. So essentially, they're trying to not fill holes in what they've got, but fill in the stuff they dug up a few years ago. So that's part of what is happening here. And the other part of that, and it goes back to the point Laura was making, because of temporary, it's really only internal people who apply for those posts. So you then end up, from the front line, to the point I made earlier, they're moving, they have to be delayed. No, you can't go because we can't backfill you. And so there's all delay. So there's issues about that.
So I get all that, but that doesn't explain the variation.
No, I was talking about the...
Okay. Why do you think there's variation?
I think there's variation because people want to do things differently and there's different hold-ups. So I couldn't comment on your specific one. I think there is a need for that national standards and a structure to monitor that and check that up. So yes, that's something which the National Social Work Agency, should we ever get one, would have a responsibility for.
So very much agree with that. I think the ring fencing of these grants is really interesting. So we've got social workers who can't do what they want to and what they've been trained to do, yet then we are funding very specific short-term projects on top of that. You know, why are we not just funding social workers to do more of what they should be doing in terms of individual, family and community well-being? What's the lack of, is there a lack of trust there? I heard earlier today, and it is a bit of a kind of a myth, that local authorities are somehow squirreling or misusing, mispurposing money somewhere. Now, if that is happening, you know, there are the means to find that out and expose that. However, in the current situation with financial austerity, it is far more likely that we're simply not able to do the things that we think are the basics and that we need to do. So, you know, I would really like to see a stop to the short-term grant funding. People have to apply for it, they have to monitor it, they have to report on it. A third of it goes in doing that kind of stuff. Let's give it as core grant funding for local authorities to do the work of well-being. Inconsistency happens for the reasons that you've had, but also because there is a difference between national and local government. And that decisions go through a layer of local government and local democracy, and that sometimes turns out slightly different answers to what are fundamentally the same questions. But that is certainly, you know, it's the layers and how, I go back to what I said at the beginning, how important the relationship between national and local government is, and the trust that comes through that, and then comes to the professionals working in that system.
Thank you. Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Staff are clearly working very hard to deliver the promise, but you've been giving various answers about what you would like to see. I would like to know maybe 1 or 2 priorities that you absolutely would want us to focus on. I've heard about more resources, less bureaucracy and an enabling environment. 1 or 2 priorities from each of you, please. And maybe start with Alison first.
Unison and Salisbury have both got campaigns at the moment, so you can go and look at our lists there. But what they're fundamentally about is getting the basics right for the profession. We need to look at pay levels. We need to look at what's happened to teachers and in the health sector over the last few years, and what has happened to social workers. Why isn't it as attractive a profession? Then we need to support people getting into it. That has to mean bursaries. It has to mean financial support to be able to do it. So they're my 2 things. Support people coming in and get the basic fundamentals right of support, of supervision, of learning and development, career pathways. And we can have a healthy and thriving profession which will deliver the promise and beyond.
I would come back to what I said earlier around sequencing and policy coherence, and just trying to provide the workforce with some clear messages of what the clear priorities are. Ben said it would be great if we could just stop making policy and let people get on with the implementation. And like Alison just said, that would help people to really keep the promise. So that counts as one, policy coherence and sequencing. I'm going to say that as one. And then tackling poverty, that's one of the very House commitments between Scottish Government and local government, tackling poverty, particularly child poverty. So a real focus on that. And I think your earlier panel emphasised enough how much that could make a difference in terms of prevention.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I'm the person who used the term enabling environment, so I'll come back to it. I think absolutely a priority for us is about reducing the amount of noise which comes from Edinburgh out to all the areas about these are the things we want your input on, these are the things we want you to be focusing on, what are your, you know, and it's constant, and it's a reality not just for those of us who operate nationally, but for the people on the ground who I'm the one then going and saying, so, you know, it's taking people away from the core task of supporting families, but also the core task of delivering the promise, which is a big change for social work. And we do need to change if we're going to deliver it. Change that we welcome and that we want. So that enabling environment that there's a priority for us is about, I think, just resetting so that the focus of the activity that comes from national government and to a significant degree from local government is about saying, what do you professions need, you workforces need to go about your job? And that would come back to earlier questions, apply to other professions who have a key role in this space. What bits of bureaucracy can we remove? You know, what bit of reporting is getting in the way? We are here to enable you to do the work for children and families. We'd love that to be the conversation. It does not feel like that.
Okay.
You offered me to So to try and add something different to what colleagues did, of which everything I'll agree with, I'm sure. But one is perhaps about professional leadership and governance. So linked to my previous answer, we haven't had a clear vision and picture of that for the past 20 years. So it's become very fragmented. Integration has made that very complicated now as well. So we do not have a consistent and coherent set of professional governance over this over our profession across the 33 employers of public sector social workers. So I think that would be something I would want to offer the committee as another area that at Social Work Scotland we're particularly interested in.
This is two things for the government, because a whole list of things for employers to do. But one of the things which I think we haven't mentioned, which I'd like to see some action on, the Promise right at the outset made a statement about there was no place for profit within childcare, looking after children. And yet we see an increasing use of private residential placements who charge an arm and a leg. In fact, we've heard stories of organisations who previously were involved in the adult care sector withdrawing from that because they can make more money, more profit, looking after children. Local authorities, because they have a shortage of spaces, I've got no choice but to use these facilities. And I spoke to one of my colleagues, actually. He was saying, you know, they then just cherry pick. They'll only take the kids that they can work with, and they'll leave the hard ones for a place. And he was incandescent. Mr. Reddy was talking about somebody being incandescent. He was incandescent because that morning I was speaking to him, he'd got a phone call from one of these private agencies saying that this 16-year-old needs to be out by Christmas because we don't want to keep him anymore. Now, there's no place for that kind. That's not care at all. And I think that would be one of the things I think the government should look at, is how we actually prevent that kind of situation arising. And that means that you don't put it into situations where the company is looking for profit. Primarily, that's what they exist to do. So that would be one thing I would want to do. And the other ask is, don't ask us to do anything else without properly funding it. Because we've had a number of things over the years where we're asked to do it, and most of these are good things, you know. So extending the age of children in care so they can stay at their 21 is a good thing, but it's not fully funded. We've got in one of my local area, I think we've got one children's home where all of the 6, I think, children are now 18. And they don't want to move out. They're quite, you know, comfortable where they are, and they're going to stay there. Now, there's other pressures therefore about how you actually support 18-year-olds. Anybody who's got teenage kids will know this. So, you know, you want to be in by 10 o'clock at night. Well, I'm going for a pint after work, kind of thing. You know, so it's different dynamics. So, don't ask us to do more things unless you're going to properly fund us to do it.
Okay. That's me, Convener.
Ross Greer.
Thanks very much, Convener. This has been touched on quite a few times already, but I just want to come back to the caseload issues at present for social workers. And I think, Stephen, you mentioned it in opening, that the reality for a lot of social workers is a huge amount of overtime, or families who are not getting to see their social worker week to week, or sometimes even for longer periods of time. So if I could ask this question in two parts. If anybody would like to expand on those comments Stephen made at the start in terms of what the reality is right now for social workers who have a caseload beyond their capacity, and what the system at present formally should be doing about that. So if we can contrast between the reality of caseworkers are working overtime and families aren't getting to see them, what policies and processes are currently in place for when a case workload is far beyond capacity? Is there, nominally at least on paper, a process for dealing with that, and that process is also just not working? Or is the assumption here that caseloads are always manageable?
Well, I'll go first if I raised it. There's an assumption that caseloads are not manageable. I think it would be our perception on it. Because cases will come in and there's a reluctance not to allocate them. So in some practices we'll just allocate them, so you end up just getting more. In some areas there's been a better system of, well, frankly, sifting them and say, well, that's not a priority. So some of the early prevention work that you would want to do is therefore just put aside, and you prioritise the crisis stuff. So you keep allocating, you know, complex cases to workers. And the thing about you can have 20 cases and be quite comfortable, and you can have one case and you're completely overrun with it, because any case itself can be it can explode at any time. So every employer will have a system for supervision and in theory caseload management, but the reality is a case comes in, it needs to be allocated to someone. We heard earlier on about the protected year for newly qualified workers, and they're notionally to only have a small number of cases. But frankly, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, you're doing all right so far. Here, I'll give you another one, and by the way, here's another one. And that very quickly gets eaten into. Where some of the special teams have been set up, where some of that is then diverted, and some of that less crisis stuff can go somewhere else. It helps, and I know a number of examples of that. But it doesn't reduce the number of child protection referrals that the crisis team then have to manage. And ultimately it becomes managed by the level of stress you can cope with. So can you work an extra hour or two every night? Can you take work home at weekend and stuff like that? One worker talks about having to choose between looking after our own kids and somebody else's kids, and that's a pressure. And you can sustain that for, some of them sustain it for years, but it can't sustain it forever. So there's a crisis management situation in there. The way to reduce it is to give us more staff. Sorry, to come back to that point.
Anyone else want to come in on case workload? Alison?
I mean, yes, caseloads are a significant problem. People working unpaid overtime to keep people safe is a significant problem. We don't have a waiting list system like perhaps we do in the health service, because when people are presenting, usually they need help now. So there is the eligibility, the triaging system that Stephen referred to. But, we do have other children's support systems, such as CAMS, mental health support for adults, substance use. All of these things are equally important in terms of people getting early support in order to then reduce the risk and the level of crisis that's happening on the kind of the children's side. So where there are long waiting lists elsewhere, what will then happen is you've got a heightening of crisis in families for a variety of reasons. Yet, as we say, social work can't turn people away, it can't run a waiting list in the same way, so it deprioritises, and the lack of prevention work, then we've got a kind of a downward spiral of more and more crisis and less preventative work.
Thanks. Ben?
So I'll probably just concentrate on the second half of your question. I think I agree with Alison. We're right. We don't have a waiting list system, but in reality, we sort of do, right? People waiting for assessment, and the reality is that we become, which I think was talked about well at the first panel, it is a risk-responsive system. So if someone seeks support, but there isn't a crisis there, so we can't get to them, so then we wait until they are in crisis, and then we have to respond to them, because that's our statutory obligation to keep that child safe. And actually, the actions then which social work have at its disposal in relation to that children and family are, as this committee well knows, not the ones that we want and need in relation to the promise, which is about keeping them safe within their family. So that is a reality. I think there's a greater use of non-social work staff who are critical to the delivery of social work assistants and so forth. But I think, again, you sort of lift up the bonnet. I think we see a greater degree of complex activity being done by those staff. And I think that's okay, as long as it's the appropriate work being done by them, but there is a reason why we have a protected profession of social work with specific responsibilities holding those for the local authority. There's obviously the reallocation of cases to others and the seniors, going back to the convener's question at the start. Some areas are, and I think it's important to mention it again, looking at technology. How do we strip bits out of what a social worker's doing so that they can? But Stephen's point earlier is really important about saying, if that's a mechanism to give them more and more cases, that's just a Faustian pack. We don't actually make any progress. But probably technology is part of the answer in there about enabling people to do their work better and well.
Thanks, Arch. And just sticking with that, as the technology as an example of reforms, and totally taking on board Stephen's point that the key solution here is more funding for more staff. But let's be pessimistic for a moment that this afternoon's budget announcement is not going to include a transformational additional settlement for local government that gets passed down to social work. You've already talked about a number of areas of potential reform that would make the system more productive and make it easier for social workers to cope with it. Are there any other areas of potential reform that haven't been mentioned so far that you'd like to mention to the committee?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing that comes to my mind, because it's very prevalent in the conversation that I'm part of with the bit of the profession that I represent, which is largely senior managers in local government social work, is this issue of trying to fulfil their responsibilities as leaders of the profession in an incredibly fragmented space now, which, local government reorganisation created that, and it has been exacerbated by integration, where it is difficult to do that once for a family work, which Alison was speaking about in this current thing. And for the leaders of that profession, it is difficult now to reach across or have a coherent picture of what your profession is. Chief social work officers now are responsible for, they're rarely directly operationally responsible for all of the social workers in their area. A family who might be engaging with all those different services, which my other colleagues on the panel have already articulated. So reform in that area is something we're very interested in, trying to learn from the past where there is lessons about actually having some coherence about a coherent professional management structure across our 32 areas.
Thanks very much. I think it says a lot about how we do governance reform in Scotland, that our multiple integration processes have led to more fragmentation.
Exactly.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. And I think that point that's just been made about the fragmentation is a really, really important one. My question was going to be on what would move towards a more positive working environment for all the staff delivering the promise. We have actually heard some of the suggestions, most recently from yourself, Ben, around digital solutions, workforce reduction, workload reduction mechanisms, more staff from Stephen, and other approaches. Is there anything that you haven't covered that you think would improve the working environment for staff that are working to deliver the promise across Scotland? I'll maybe start with Stephen, if that's okay.
Yeah. I'll send you our list of demands that we recently had a conference about, that Ben and others spoke at, which is about addressing specifically the working conditions of staff. There's a number. These are things not necessarily for the government, but social workers find themselves working in offices where they're hot desking, where they're working from home, things like that. Some of that came about through necessity in COVID, but it also came about through cuts to reducing the number of offices and all the rest of it. It doesn't work for social workers. Social workers, as I heard earlier on, if you're out visiting a family and it's a difficult situation and stuff like that, you do need to go back to base and be able to sit down, relax, talk to colleagues, share that information. Going back to sit on a computer and a Teams discussion is not the same. So there's issues like that we need to provide the right kind of working conditions for social workers, for that team support. I've been around social work for a very long time, and that was always part of it. You go back there. I wasn't a social worker, but regularly I was a social worker sitting on the edge of my desk offloading. But that's really important. It's about this is what happened to me. What about this, and how? And people get to share that. So that would be one thing that we need to look at the estate that we're asking people to work in. That kind of so-called modern doesn't do it. And that's one of the concerns we have about AI, because if AI takes away some of that reflective practice from colleagues, and it's a computer doing the reflective practice, I'm concerns about that. They're not all like that, but that would be one of the concerns, and we shouldn't rush into. So that would be one of the things we want to do. Also, time for training, time for actual training, reflecting on your practice and training, because the number of times that social workers, sometimes there's a budget issue again about whether we have to, but they get access to training and then don't turn up because they're having to manage a caseload. So having protected time for genuine training, not just doing it at home, which is what a lot of them have to do. They read up things and they go online and search their own stuff. But actually protected time, so that they actually have that time to actually have proper training, share with colleagues and reflect on their practice would be. So those are the two things I'd add to what I've said previously.
Thank you. Okay.
I think they're great ones, because I think we haven't given them enough time on the panel yet. I agree that physical proximity to colleagues, I'd perhaps extend it, not to repeat entirely what Stephen said. There's also that physical proximity to your communities, and doing your social work from the front seat of your car outside someone's house is a situation which is, I suppose, a reality, and practically will always be a feature of the work. But absolutely agree with Stephen that ability to come back to the ability to have spaces where you can have private conversations both again with colleagues and with those you support. And I just want to emphasise the protected time for learning and development bit as well, which features very much on both Unison's and SASWA's sort of campaigns at the moment. It's critical, and again, it's critical. I'm underlining it because again, we can introduce learning and development. Fraser rightly mentioned the trauma work. If social workers don't have the time to engage with those good initiatives, where again we're throwing things at the profession, where we're actually undermining their confidence in some say, saying, look, here are opportunities we're offering you, but we're not giving you any time to actually engage with them.
Thank you. Do the other panel members want to add anything?
Perhaps add support from other professions, kind of the multi-agency element to that, so that other professions are supporting social work in what they're doing, and also leadership in terms of right from chief exec level down would probably be the things I would add to that.
Thank you.
I'd want to also have a look at the role of social work employers in supporting the profession. I think because our employers and basically local government helps create the social work profession, it comes down through national to local government. I think when you look at a social worker's contract, it will say the hours that you're going to work and what you're going to get paid and what your holiday is, but there is little commitment from the employer, who has in the governance structure the kind of the roles and the duties and the responsibilities of social work, of what you're going to give to your social workers as part of their professional development, part of your responsibility for them as a profession. So we go back to the learning. I think the advanced practice framework that Oxford Scottish Government have been working on is really important, and that needs to be taken forward by the National Social Work Agency. Fundamentally, fewer vacancies. We need to sort that out. Flexible and supportive working, and I think the visibility in communities and going where the people are. The people shouldn't need to find us. We should be where the people are. School-based, but not just for school-age children, for communities, attached GP practices, available where there are still community centres. We should be available. They should be normal front doors, non-stigmatising, unitary front doors that people can get to us and get the support they need.
If I may, just actually, because Alison just prompted it, there is, and it's in Stephen's Charter of Demands, actually, the reality that in social work, social workers are obligated to adhere to a code of practice, which, if they do not, their registration is at risk. We have a code for employers, which is not statutory, and they aren't held to in some respects. So there is a tension there that perhaps is something we could look at in the future.
Thank you. I wanted just to build actually the point about the code of practice and statutory codes of practice, to move slightly to the point that Laura Cavan, you made around other services. And we've heard about the role of schools in that. And one of the things that the Additional Support for Learning Board that I think, Laura, you're co-chair of from COSLA, has highlighted is the importance of refreshing the code of practice on learning for pupils with additional support needs. But it appears to be quite a way down the line before that's going to be looked at. And also one of the areas within the plan that's been identified as having 0 actions completed is resources. So I wondered, Laura, whether you could talk a bit about whether or not you feel there's enough pace of the work within the ASL Programme Board that will help to make those connections across the different agencies that you highlighted, and also whether or not you think the code of practice is going to be updated anytime soon.
I'll start with the code of practice, if that's okay. So the code of practice, I understand, is early. I think work has started on that, and I know that desk, Director of Education, ASN, Additional Support Needs network is closely involved in that. So I understand that is underway. I accept the point that perhaps pace is required there, and happy to pick that up. And you made a point about resources. Sorry, I didn't pick that up. Could you repeat it?
So the progress report on the ASL action plan, the one area of recommendations where there have been, and the progress report says 0 actions complete, is on resources. And we've heard a lot about resources this morning. So how important do you think that it is that there's a change in that? I'll come back to something else in a moment.
That's fine. I think that is really important, and I think that it's been something that we have picked up through the discussions, which I won't rehearse in detail here, that we've been having with Scottish Government around teacher numbers, and the fact that if there was more flexibility around that, then we'd be able to perhaps turn some of the funding that is perhaps that could be used to support children with additional support needs in other ways that isn't necessarily about teachers. So we've been having those conversations. It wasn't possible to do everything at once in terms of the ASL action plan. So the actions that haven't been completed are planned to kind of be progressed in the next few months. What we are doing through the project board is looking at the ones that haven't been progressed and trying to prioritise some of those, again coming back to what I said earlier in a different context about what will have the most impact for the most people, or what is the most pressing at this point in time. I think resources, it's hard to argue that isn't, but I mean we're driven, as others have said, by often ring-fence short-term pots of funding, but that's a kind of a conversation that's ongoing. You said you had another question.
On the point about partly resources, but also just, we heard from children and young people that when they move from children's services to adult services, from care experienced young people, there's a bit of a drop-off, and they feel like there's a cliff edge, in fact. What are your organisations doing to improve that transition position? I was worried to hear the other day that since the Parliament debated a bill on transitions, there's only been, I think, £19,000 spent on transitions in Scotland, which worries me hugely, given the key part that plays in the people's lives, and particularly the experience of care experienced young people.
I understand that the transitions strategy is under development and should be published early next year. But as someone else said earlier, strategies, legislation, that isn't the thing that makes the change, it's the implementation that makes the change. And we hear often that transitions are not what they should be in terms of additional support needs and in terms of care experienced children and young people. So, my mind's gone blank, sorry.
If it's not strategies and it's not legislation, what is it that's going to change
it's
the
time,
dial
relationships, multi-agency working, it's staff having the adequate resource and there being enough of a workforce to spend that time with children and young people. It's people being able to, young people themselves being able to advocate for what they want and what they need and make decisions themselves about how they want that transition to look and how they want their future to look. And a kind of an individualised approach to that, which is what GIRFEC is all about.
But can I just press you on that, because we've also heard from other members of the panel that if it isn't statutory, it's not getting done.
That's true.
So how does that square with what you've just said?
Yeah, I mean, what I was referring to was, I think it was Claire had said that we think that legislation and policy is going to be the answer to things, but if the resource isn't behind the legislation and it isn't behind the policy, then that isn't, that it doesn't translate. So, I mean, both things are true. I think Fraser said that on something else earlier as well. So, I do come back to the fact that you need the time, you need the resource, and you need the workforce to be able to do any of these things, regardless of whether you've got legislation, policy, strategies, whatever it is.
So if I can come in on the transitions, I think it's something that we've been wrestling with for a long time in Social Work Scotland. Again, within the sort of management of the profession, I think there's an awareness, and I think your own work has really profiled this, that so much good work and so much good support is actually undermined by that transition between child and adult services. We're, of course, big supporters of the principles of good transition, which are there. And in terms of what we've been trying to do as an organisation is to try and bridge that fragmentation, because the fragmentation is part of it. We have fragmented services. In social work, we have a fragmented leadership structure over there. So we've been trying to use our structure to try and attend to that. I can't say that has delivered dramatic change yet, or will, but I think it's something that we can do in that space. Your point about statutory, though, just prompted me as well, because I think you're right that there is that tendency towards statutory, but actually supporting families is a statutory function of social work. And actually often what we're talking about is which bits of statute are the bits that are really getting the attention and the focus. I think we've pretty much made everything statutory now in terms of things, but it's about, you know, what actually we collectively as Scotland are saying is really important, and actually the protection of children from harm is deemed more important in a risk behaviour than supporting them at an early stage, even though I could easily say that that's a statutory function of social work. So there's a hierarchy of statutory. It's not just that something is statutory or isn't.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you. Good now, panel. I've got a couple of questions round about our care experienced young people. They told the committee that they often do not manage to keep the same social worker, and this has a negative impact on their care journeys. So can I ask what's being done to ensure that as few care experienced young folk as possible are impacted by this lack of continuity? Ben, you're smiling at me. I'm going to go.
I'm smiling. Sorry, it's a rueful smile. It's a smile of pain.
I meant just that you caught.
No. I did. No, absolutely. No. It's entirely justified to come to me. It's possible, as you were asking the question and you were articulating that anguish from care experienced people, that lived reality of too much change, the inability to hold on to relationship. It's exactly the same in reverse. So for those social workers as well. So it really is one of the core jobs of children and family social work managers to try and reduce that. They want to, for their staff, because they know that is the instrument through which we improve outcomes for children and families, is the social worker and other staff, is to try and deliver that consistency. But if we have inexperienced staff holding two big cases, making a choice that actually I might be able to do something else that's less stressful than this, I don't have to work 70 hours this week, we can't stop them from doing that. And I think that brings us back to the core reason for this panel. And these are not things that a social work manager can do on their own. They can try and do, some of them will take on cases to try and reduce that burden, to try and lighten the load for that individual social worker. Please stay, keep those relationships, because if we can't, we're going to disrupt again. So what you've described is our core priority. We see that as how we will make a meaningful difference in terms of delivering the promise. But if we don't do much else of what we've spoken about today, we're effectively fighting a losing battle. So
moving forward, though, how can we reduce that impact? Does that mean, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, are you saying that social workers are just given a care experienced person, or is there an in-depth look into what the needs of that person are, and is the social worker equipped to deal with those?
So we do try and do that, absolutely. But again, if you're, that is a luxury of time. It's an incredibly time-poor system. And that would be true of placement with foster carers and placement. It's a reality in our system that effectively, and one of the reasons Stephen mentioned about the use of the private sector is they have a placement, and that's what we're having to do. Matching at all levels about forming a relationship, absolutely critical to success. Social work is a relational practice where the use of self is the thing that you are deploying. And as Trish said from this seat, social workers are trained and equipped to do that. But again, if we're saying we're just having to allocate cases so we can deal with the risk, that becomes a luxury that is hard to do, however much we're trying to do it. Am I answering your question?
I don't think I've heard how we're going to reduce it, or if you ruled the world, how you were able to reduce it.
You need to have social workers with much smaller caseloads. You need to have an appropriately sized management structure to be able to allocate those appropriately, to know their staff, have the opportunities for reflection and supervision. Is this a connection, a dynamic which is working? But I mean, I know both Stephen and Alison will probably have lots to say on this too. But it is possible, but only if we attend to the fact that the workforce needs to be doing the appropriate amount for each individual worker, not what the system needs each individual worker to do so that we can allocate cases.
Okay.
I think what you're describing is a symptom of the crisis. I mean, until we solve the crisis, I'm afraid that sort of thing is going to happen, because social workers will go off sick, or social workers will go off to a different job. You can't tie them down unless we address the issues which would retain the staff. And they want to stay in that particular field. And many of them do, but not in the current circumstances. That's the difficulty. So I think, I don't know what the answer is in the short term. I don't think there's any manager you can say, right, you will not change that care, because the worker can choose to go somewhere else. I think the point I raised about the placements in private sectors, one of the things that we do, want to ensure is that when a young person goes to whatever kind of placement, that's not a short-term fix. That it is going to be that they'll be looked after and cared for and loved in that situation. But where we have organisations and companies who can pick and choose whether they, no, that's too much and we want to move them on and stuff like that, and just effectively hand them back to the social work with a few weeks' notice. So we need to address that issue, and that's why I raised it in terms of the private sector, using the private sector in that way. We need to have a more stable environment for that kind of placement, as well as a more stable workforce for social workers. But we need to address all the other issues first: funding, number of staff, caseloads, etc.
Okay. And I'll be quick. So I think the question is right. Why are we burning through social workers? Some of them move around the system into different teams to get a break from particular stresses that they have. We have a problem with local pay differentials. So some people will move for, that can be up to £6,000 or £7,000 across Scotland. So that's significant pay differential. But the other thing I think that we're not doing, and that the promise is really about, is about valuing the relationship. If we really value relationships, we need to enable people to stay. We instead of measuring tasks and time, we need to look at the long-term value of relationships with communities and families and the children and young people who need our support. So instead of task efficiency, if you like, we need to look at efficacy, about what works for people in a much longer-term frame.
Okay. The care experienced young folk also told the committee that they felt there was a lack of support for those that seemed to be making good progress. And also, once they left care, they were kind of left to it. So how can we address those issues, both in the short term and as the reforms progress?
As we've said, I think probably several.
So it's just lack of staff.
It's lack of staff, bluntly. If we've got more people to not only deal with the crises as they happen, but to kind of take on people when they're coming to us, rather than say go away until you're worse, which is effectively what we're saying. Go away till you're having a crisis, okay? And that's what happens if you've got a caseload where some things need a lot of your attention and some things seem to be going smoothly. Right? Where do you focus? You don't have time to do everything. You simply don't have time. So we need to make capacity in the system.
Laura?
The second part of your question there's something about the relationships with other parts of the workforce. So, for example, youth work is absolutely key, but it's one of the areas which, when local authorities' budgets are under significant pressure, it is at risk increasingly. But, for example, if there are relationships that can be built with, and that's not to undermine or undervalue the role that social workers have, but if things are going smoothly and going well, then actually a consistent relationship with a supportive youth worker or some other supporter, whether that's local authority or whether that's third sector, wherever that might be, can be really beneficial in enhancing their opportunities and their lives generally. So I think it's about looking wider about how we facilitate, how social work, how others facilitate building relationships with other parts, with other adults that can support them.
Okay, working together. Okay.
Thank you. And Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I think you've answered a lot of my questions in relation to actions I was going to ask around workforce planning, etc. But I wanted to return to some of the line of questioning Jackie Dunbar just had there, because I think the principles of good transition, which you touched on, Ben, and just wondered, in your own opinion, how much of the promise, a percentage you might want to give, do you think is now actually being delivered? And I ask that question because, like Willie Rennie said in the previous session, we met young people back in 2020. They thought this was a really good piece of work. We're halfway through. They are becoming cynical about what this means. And I'm concerned that the lessons I've learnt and heard from young people around the removal of CSOs at 16, for example, to manage casework, are still happening today. So bad decisions, lack of advocacy, seems to still be in the system. So just wondered, in terms of the promise and that change around transition, how much of that do you think actually is in reality now being delivered on the ground? Ben, as I mentioned to you, I'll maybe bring you in first. I know it's a difficult question.
No, it is. It is a difficult question, but it's a great question, and it's one that I think we are or should all be asking ourselves. I think the promise. This is a personal answer to the question rather than an organisational one. The promise strikes me as being something where we haven't arrived until we've arrived, you know, and although. So I can appreciate for care experienced young people, until we've delivered the promise, it's all going to be an aspiration. And I suppose to try and answer your question even more, less esoterically than that, I think it doesn't feel like we're making the progress that we could or should be. I take on board absolutely what Fiona said about the pandemic and about the conversations around the National Care Service. But I hope, as my input today has shown, I think from our point of view, actually some real core attention to some of those foundations which the promise identifies, such as the workforce. I think the situation 5 years on now is worse for the workforce than it was in 2020. And I think if we can't get that foundation right, the rest of it will always remain beyond our reach, and care experienced people some will experience improvement in their area, there's no doubt. My confidence about whether that can be sustained is a separate question then. You know, and again, we see pockets of improvement everywhere. Can it be sustained? Is it becoming business as usual? And that's a real challenge of implementation. So I don't want to take away from all of those pockets of good practice, but overall, collectively, and our promise for care experienced children and young people, I think we're not making the progress that we can and should.
I'm not going to give you a percentage. I don't think that's possible. The commitment absolutely remains, and part of the rationale behind the progress framework that's a joint Scottish Government, local government and Promise Scotland framework is so that we can see in one place for the first time how all of the different indicators that we already have demonstrate how well we are keeping the promise. And I think at best it'll be a mixed news story. And I think that the purpose then will be to look at, well, where do we direct our attention, our actions and our next steps. So that's kind of, I think that we're at almost the midway point. Is the timing of the progress framework is helpful in that we can now look at, well, how much have we done, how much have we still got to go, and where do we direct our actions based on the evidence that we've got just now, and what evidence do we not have that we need to get in order to know what we do next too.
Alison, Stephen, could you come in?
I mean, I think we've defined kind of two sets of churn here, which is churn in projects and short-term funding, and churn in workers. And when you've got both of those things going on at the same time, you've got a system that is simply really, really unstable and not helpful to the people who need support and who will need support over years. So, you know, we need to return from projects to core work. I think, yes, we always have to look at what other professions can help with social workers, but if we cut off all the good bits, all the preventative work and all the community work that social workers want to do, we're simply going to give them child protection, and that isn't what social workers come into social work to do. So I think we have to be very thoughtful about the kind of profession that nationally and locally we are creating. We have a responsibility there. And I think my members would say is that whilst they see some of the projects delivering, they don't see why that shouldn't be part of core work, and that in addition to that, it is about resources, it's about their time, and it's also about the additional supports often from the third sector, but the resources then that communities and families have, you know, and health and youth work and all of these other things that are all required to work together and be solid and not in churn to deliver the promise.
I mean, I remember one of my colleagues said to me that when the promise came out at first, it's not that there's nothing radical in that, it's just good social work they're describing, and that's the truth. And the question, I mean, what people said, we're making progress but it's not going fast enough. The key question is whether we can continue making progress or we'll start going backwards, and if we don't have the resources, we will be going backwards, and that was my concern.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thanks, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you very much for your evidence. We've overrun a little bit, which I think just shows the interest from committee members, who are very grateful for your time today and your answers. And I will suspend for 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.